We'll kill the old red rooster when she comes."
"I just saw Hagbard Celine,"
said Winifred Sour.
"Naturally, he'd be here, with all his minions and catamites,"
said Wilhelm Sour.
"We've got to expect to go right down to the wire on this."
"I wonder what he's planning,"
said Werner Sour.
"Nothing,"
said Wolfgang Sour.
"In my opinion, he's planning nothing at all. I know how his mind works. Head full of oriental mystical mush. He's going to rely on his intuition to tell him what to do. He hopes to make it more difficult for us to anticipate his actions, since he himself doesn't know what they will be. But he's wrong. His field of action is drastically limited, and there's nothing he can do to stop us."
First, the towers appeared over the black-green tops of the pines. They looked like penitentiary guard towers, though in fact the men in them were unarmed, and their primary purpose was to house spotlights and loudspeakers. Then the road turned, and they were walking next to a 20-foot-high wire fence. Running parallel to this was an inner fence 30 feet away and about the same height. Beyond that were bright green hillsides. The promoters of the festival had chopped down and sold all the trees on the hills within the fenced-off area, bulldozed the stumps, and covered the raw earth with fresh sod. Already the green was partially covered by crowds of people. Tents had popped up like mushrooms, and banners waved in the air. A huge sign over the stage announced that the Oklahoma Home Demonstration Club was playing, and the loudspeakers thundered out an old favorite of that group, Custer Stomp. Behind the stage, the 4 members of the American Medical Association stood apart and gazed out at the sunset. They were wearing iridescent black tunics and trousers. Members of other bands stood together and talked, many of the groups happy to be meeting each other for the first time. They even fraternized with a few intrepid kids who managed to infiltrate past the guards and make it to the back side of the stage hill. But white-suited attendants kept the public and fellow performers away from the American Medical Association. This was generally accepted as the AMA's privilege. They were, after all, universally acclaimed as the greatest rock group in the world. Their records sold the most. Their tours drew audiences that dwarfed even those of the Beatles. Their sound was everywhere. As the Beatles had, for a time, expressed the new freedom of the 60s, so the AMA seemed to epitomize the repressive spirit of the 70s. The secret of their popularity was that they were so appalling. They reminded their fans of all the evils that were being daily visited upon them, and thus hearing and seeing them was like scratching a very bad itch. They suggested that perhaps youth had captured its oppressors or identified with them, and they momentarily turned the pain of the whole scene into pleasure. To learn how to enjoy suffering, since suffering was their lot, kids by the millions flocked to hear the AMA.
"Like a radiant heater,"
said Wolfgang.
"We at the center. Our message projected into a ball of vibrant young human consciousnesses, massively reflected by them back across the lake, into the lake to the depths of a mile. There, reaching the sunken army, raising them, in a sense, from the dead."
"We are so close to realizing the dream of 30,000 years,"
said Winifred.
"Will we be able to do it? Will we be the ones who complete the work begun by the great Gruad? And if not, what will become of us?"
"Doubtless we will scream in hell for all eternity,"
said Werner matter-of-factly.
"What would you do to us if we failed?"
"We need fear eternity only if the Eater of Souls is on the scene,"
said Wilhelm.
"And they've still got him imprisoned inside the Pentagon."
"Let no one speak of failure,"
said Wolfgang.
"It is absolutely impossible for us to fail. The plan is foolproof."
Winifred shook her head.
"Fools are precisely what it is not proof against, and you, Wolfgang, know that best of all."
At 5:45 in Washington, D.C., the switchboard at the Pentagon was warned that bombs planted somewhere in the building would go off in 10 minutes.
"You killed hundreds of us today in the streets of Washington,"
said the woman's voice.
"but we are still giving you a chance to evacuate the building. You do not have time to find the bombs. Leave the Pentagon now and let history be the judge of which side truly fought for life and against death."
The highest-ranking personnel in the Pentagon, and with revolution breaking out in the nation's capital, everybody was there, were immediately moved to underground bomb-proof shelters. The Secretary of Defense, after consulting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, declared that there was a 95% probability that the threat was a hoax, intended to disrupt the job of coordinating the suppression of revolution across the nation. A search would be instituted, but meanwhile work would go on as usual.
Besides,
The Secretary of Defense joked to the Chief of Staff Army,
well, one of those little radical bombs would do as much damage to this building as a firecracker would to an elephant.
Somehow the fact that the caller had said bombs, plural, had not gotten through, and the actual explosions were far more powerful than the caller had implied. Since a proper investigation was never subsequently undertaken, no one knows precisely what type of explosive was used, how many bombs there were, how they were introduced into the Pentagon, where they were placed, and how they were set off. Nor was the most interesting question of all ever satisfactorily answered: who done it? In any case, at 5:55 p.m. Washington time, a series of explosions destroyed 1/3 of the riverside of the Pentagon, ripping through all 4 rings from the innermost courtyard to the outermost wall. There was great loss of life. Hundreds of people who had been working on that side of the building were killed. Although the explosion had not visibly touched their bomb-proof shelter, the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and numerous other high-ranking military persons were found dead. It was assumed that the concussion had killed them, and in the ensuing chaos nobody bothered to examine the bodies carefully. After the explosions, the Pentagon was belatedly evacuated, in the expectation that there might be more of the same. There was no more, but the U.S. military establishment was temporarily without a head. Another casualty was Mr. H.C. Winifred of the U.S. Department of Justice. A civil servant with a long and honorable career behind him, Winifred, apparently deranged by the terrible events of that day of infamy, took the wheel of a Justice Department limousine and drove wildly, running 23 red lights, to the Pentagon. He raced to the scene of the explosion, brandishing a large piece of chalk, and was trying to draw a chalk line from one side of the gap in the Pentagon wall to the other, when he collapsed and died, apparently of a heart attack. At 11:45 Ingolstadt time, the loudspeakers and the sign over the stage announced the American Medical Association. After a 10-minute ovation, the 4 strange-eyed, ash-blonde young people began to play their most popular song, Age of Bavaria. In Los Angeles, the Mercalli scale on the UCLA seismograph jumped abruptly to grade 1.
Gonna be a little disturbance,
Dr. Volkentroll said calmly, noting the rise. Grade 1 wasn't serious.
What made you think we'd find him down here?
Saul asked.
Common sense and psychology,
Dillinger said.
I know pimps. He'd shit purple before he'd get the guts to try to cross the border. They're strictly mama's boys. The first place I'd look was his own cellar, because he might have a hidden room there.
Barney laughed.
That's the first place Saul looked, too.
We seem to think alike, Mr. Dillinger.
Saul said dryly.
There isn't much difference between a cop and a crook, psychologically speaking.
Dillinger mused.
Wonder what the hell is in that suitcase.
Dillinger murmured.
I'll open it,
Saul said.
We'll all have to take the antidote anyway after this. I have a supply out in the car.
And he leaned forward, parted Carmel's stiff blue hands, and tugged the suitcase free. Barney, Dillinger, and Markoff Cheney crowded close to look as he snapped the lock and lifted the top.
I'll be damned and double damned,
Barney Muldoon said in a small, hollow voice.
My fellow Americans, it is with a heavy heart that I come before you for the second time today. Many irresponsible elements have reacted to the national emergency with mad animal panic, and they are endangering all the rest of us. I assure you again, in the words of a great former leader, that we have nothing to fear but fear itself.
The face on the TV screen expressed absolute confidence, and many citizens felt a slight upsurge in hope. Actually, he was totally around the bend on Demerol, and when the White House had burned earlier in the day, his most constructive suggestion had been, "Let's toast some marshmallows before we leave."
Even as I speak to you, the director of the FBI has assured me that his men are closing in on the one single plague carrier who has caused all this hysteria. If you stay in your homes, you will be safe, and the emergency will soon be over."
"Rosebuds?"
cried John Dillinger.
"Why the hell would he bring a suitcase full of rosebuds down here?"
Outside Lehman Cave, Saul loads the antidote needle.
"I'll go first,"
says John Herbert Dillinger, rolling up his sleeve.
At this hour, when your government needs your faith.
In a fusillade of bullets, the president sank beneath the podium, leaving only the seal of the chief executive on the TV screens. The viewers saw the same confident expression on his face as he floated in Demerol tranquility toward death. "Oh my God!" said an announcer's voice off-screen. In Mad Dog, John Hoover Dillinger looks at Jim Cartwright quizzically.
"Whose conspiracy was behind that?"
he asks, as the announcer gibbers hysterically.
"There seems to have been 5 people shooting from 5 different parts of the press corps, but the president may not be dead."
They blew his fucking head to a pulp.
Another voice near the microphone said, distinctly and hopelessly.